and how to harness private finance to meet our climate ambitions. And for those that don't know me, my name is Will Tanner. I'm the director of Onward, and we're a think tank dedicated to strengthening economic opportunity and strengthening communities in every part of the UK, especially in those places where those things haven't been there for some time. And I want to start by thanking first our three fantastic speakers for being with us this morning at an incredibly busy point in the political and media cycle, and also all of you for joining us in the room and online as well. And I should pay special tribute to Lombard Odier for supporting Onward in putting on this event, and thank you very much for that. I think you'll all agree this event is very timely. We may have 30 years to act according to legislation, but we have far less than that if we are going to achieve our climate aims successfully. And we need markets to play their part fully. Private finance needs to not only be available for new green projects, as I'm sure the Global Investment Summit in a few weeks' time will showcase, but also to deploy large amounts of existing capital with net zero in mind. We need to make green finance the mainstream of finance. But to achieve that virtuous cycle, we need companies to disclose more and better information on their climate plans. We need investors to be making more informed decisions about where to allocate capital. And we need long-term certainty and ambition from politicians, not just here in the UK, but across different jurisdictions too. This is an enormous opportunity for the UK in particular. We have deep capital markets. We have a world-beating record on decarbonisation. And this year, of course, we host COP in Glasgow. But we also have a long way to go. And as we sit here today, it is true that only £1 in every 12 pounds of ESG inflows go to UK-based companies. And I think it's still true that there is no standalone pure play renewable company listed in the UK. So big challenges, but also big opportunities. And we have a terrific panel to get in this morning. I'm delighted to introduce them one by one. Firstly, we will hear from Kwasi Kwarteng MP, the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, the man leading the charge across government and coming up with the policies which are going to get us to that net zero target by 2050. Secondly, we will hear from Rial Murray Thomas, Chief Executive of the Green Finance Institute and formerly of Barclays, where she chaired the Green Banking Council there. And finally, I will come to Hubert Keller, who's the Senior Managing Partner at Lombard Odier and leads that firm's work to align investment strategies with net zero. How this will work is very simple and very familiar. I'm going to turn to each of our speakers to give 5 minutes of introductory remarks to set out their thoughts on this enormous challenge, not just for policymakers, but also for markets and firms themselves. And then we will open up to question and answers, primarily from the people gathered here in the office. So please do store up your questions and be ready when we finish with opening remarks, but I'll try and take some questions from our online audience too. So if you are watching online, please do put a question in the Q&A function on Zoom and it will be transmitted to me electronically. We've only got 45 minutes and I'm very keen to keep to time. So I'm going to keep my remarks there and I'm going to hand over without further ado to the Secretary of State.
Thank you very much, Will. And I just wanted to make a number of opening remarks, as it were, and really reflections on my 2 years, more than 2 years, firstly as Energy Minister and now as Secretary of State for BEIS, as Will described. It seemed to me that the challenge, and I started my role as Energy Minister on July the 24th, 2019, a date etched in my mind. And it was significant to me, not only because I was appointed as Energy Minister, but it was actually only about 3 or 4 weeks after we enshrined the net zero target in legislation. So net zero was, I think, at the end of June 2019, and really has shaped our energy policy and has shaped our international engagement on energy. And it seemed to me at the time that the nature of the problem was very complicated, and we needed to take a very, very broad approach in terms of the technologies that we wanted to focus on. And we shouldn't at this stage be betting on particular technologies. It seemed to me that the solution was actually across a range of technologies. And people often, because they're bidding or seeking to promote their own particular technology, they had this view that hydrogen would defeat everything else, or electrification would defeat everything else. And I saw it as a kind of Wimbledon. Vaguely topical. I suppose I should say US Open, to be very current. of technologies, and somehow there'd be a one technology at the end that would prove itself to be superior to all the others. I think that approach was wrong. And I think you have to have a breadth of technologies. Now, if you're going to have a breadth of technologies, it doesn't make sense just to have one source of capital, okay? Because there are lots and lots of, the way the market works is that you have people investing in lots of different technologies. And the only way we're going to get to net zero, the second thought I had was that the government in and of itself could not spend its way to net zero. There had to be a leveraging of private capital. And that was obvious to me within the first week of the job. Breadth of technologies and private sector buy-in. We were fortunate enough, I think, in the UK to actually have a living example of this. The offshore wind sector, for example, is the kind of classic case where the government set an investable framework, the CFD rounds, and it was the private sector that actually built and invested in those offshore wind farms. And I and the Prime Minister went to Moray East in Scotland, and we saw huge amounts of installations, turbines. We've attracted a huge amount of investment, and that investment is coming from the private sector. There's no way that any government in the world could have rolled out the offshore wind industry in the way that we've done. So that represents a huge private investment opportunity. And I feel that that can be replicated in hydrogen. We've got a hydrogen strategy coming out, which has come out just a few weeks ago. And again, we need to have an investable proposition there in terms of carbon capture as well. And just finally, if you look at the strides we've made, I was particularly struck in the last year. The Chancellor committed to TCFD mandatory disclosures by 2025, and also the green sovereign bond. That was the other thing that I've been campaigning very, very consistently for. And I'm delighted that we're going to be actually issuing green sovereign bonds, I think, in the autumn. So there again, through the bond market, where it's private money, that's the whole point of having a bond market. So there's no way that anyone could do this without significant private investment. I think there's a lot more we could do in terms of the issuance of green bonds and actually coming up with the technologies and an investable structure for them. And we're just really at the beginning of that. And it's a very exciting journey. So I'm very, very pleased to be here. And I think that I'm very much looking forward to hearing from Rianne Marie and Hubert as well, who are financiers, and hear their insights about how important this subject is.
Thank you very much. I mean, it's precisely what you just referred to, bringing together policymakers and people from the finance industry to have this conversation. That's exactly why we wanted to put on this event. And thank you very much, Secretary of State. Rianne Marie, over to you.
Oh, well, thank you very much for inviting me this morning and for giving me the opportunity to share a few remarks. The transition to a net zero carbon economy is clearly a very capital intensive business. It requires rebuilding the asset base, which companies have invested in over decades. And that presents capital providers with a huge opportunity for investment, but also considerable risk. The introduction of new, unfamiliar net zero carbon technologies to industrial processes that have been honed to maximize efficiency introduces uncertainty and potential near-term competitive disadvantages to first movers. And that poses a real challenge to mainstream capital providers. Early stage technology or new disruptive business models are typically financed through venture capital, but those funds rarely invest hundreds of millions in a single venture. Then you've got pension and sovereign wealth funds, and they're some of the biggest project and infrastructure investors globally with sufficient capital and ability to invest at scale. Collectively, they represent about $17 trillion in assets under management. However, they're necessarily very conservative in their investment approaches and certainly have limited appetite for technology risk. So what about green bonds, the poster child of green finance for the past decade? Last year, we saw $270 billion of green bonds getting raised, which is another record as that market continues to expand at pace. But a prerequisite for a green bond issuer is the ability to generate steady cash flows, which means these aren't the appropriate instruments when cash flows are uncertain, as is typically the case when you're developing and scaling new technological solutions or indeed projects where there's a really long lead time between the initial capital investment and the generation of predictable regular cash flows. So it's clear, and I'm obviously building on the points made by the Secretary of State, that no single type of financial institution or instrument can meet the investment that's needed. Instead, we're going to need this collaborative effort between all aspects of the financial ecosystem. So it's the venture capitalists, it's the private equity funds, it's the banks, it's the real asset investment fund managers, investing alongside public sector and philanthropic capital, which is obviously becoming a bigger and bigger contributor to this entire discussion. In fact, public sector finance is absolutely critical to de-risk the investment life cycle of new technologies and longer term infrastructure so that private finance can then be deployed in the real economy at scale. So identifying and co-designing the most effective interventions of public impact finance so that we can create the conditions for private finance to flow. That forms the basis of our work at the Green Finance Institute, where we focus on co-designing incentives and financial solutions by sector so that governments can deploy capital to maximize the crowding in of private sector co-investment. That can be through providing tax credits, loan guarantees, revenue guarantees, contracts for difference, cornerstone investment for green banks or funds, or through creating the demand to drive economies of scale for currently costlier green products through subsidizing consumers directly or purchasing through public procurement budgets. Now, all this is pretty well established thinking, and apologies to those of you who haven't heard anything new, but what is new, what is absolutely unprecedented as we count down to COP26 are all these commitments from the mainstream financial institutions to reach net zero. The 55 members of the Net Zero Banking Alliance, for example, represent a quarter of global banking assets. Those are institutions representing $37 trillion of assets, and they need to find new green revenues opportunities that both meet the required risk-adjusted returns and meet their net zero commitments. Else, think about this for a minute, they're going to have to pursue a strategy of shrinking to greenness. It's pretty unattractive. So yes, we need the clear policy signals, including a carbon tax levied on the highest emitters, in order to spur action and innovation. But we also need the clear financial mechanisms and the public finance infrastructure with a clear mandate and an appetite to share risk and build markets. And here in the UK, and I'll wrap my comments up in a second, well, here in the UK, the new UK Infrastructure Bank could become that vehicle, taking a role as a catalyst, leveraging its balance sheet to convert net zero commitments into short-term investment targets and unlocking that wall of private capital. Incidentally, those sort of similar credit enhancement mechanisms are what's needed in order to deploy more capital into that multi-trillion investment gap that we have in emerging markets of Africa, Asia, and South America, as our work at the Institute is uncovering. But I want to just stick in my final comment to the domestic agenda. Our strapline at the Green Finance Institute has always been channeling global capital to local solutions. So we recognise from the outset that some of the key challenges of the net zero transition, in particular when we're looking at decarbonising heating or transport, it requires the transformation of the places where we live and work. They are inherently local challenges, and technologies, whether they're proven or unproven, are not going to roll out as effectively or successfully as they could without designing or demonstrating them around our local communities and our consumers. So in reaching the government's net zero ambitions, local government, including mayoral combined authorities, have a really crucial role. Efficiently unlocking the capital is going to be critical, as is the infrastructure to channel that capital effectively towards where we need it to invest. Thanks so much.
Brianne-Marie, thank you so much. You just echoed a lot of things, especially at the end, that Onward has written in various reports. And I think actually just that final point links very clearly the government's net zero ambitions with the government's levelling up agenda. And I think net zero could be, if deployed correctly, one of the best tools to level up different parts of the country. But we can get into that in Q&A perhaps. Hubert, over to you.
Thank you, Will. I think it's absolutely true. Our industry, which is the investment industry, which sits on $120 trillion of capital, is increasingly committing to reaching net zero. And indeed, as Rian just said, a number of us have signed up and committed to basically deploy capital with a net zero mindset. I would just like to share with you in my few introductory comments some of the challenges as an industry that we face in trying to redeploy capital or allocate capital with a net zero mindset, because it's not to be underestimated. And I think it's important also to realize some of the potential avenues that we can explore and we could explore further. The first big challenge is that we all need to understand in the investment industry the reality of the climate-related financial exposure. Regardless of the scenario that one has in mind in respect of climate or climate change, there is today real financial exposure. If we think, for example, that if one of you think that we are going to reach the maximum of 1.5 to 2 degree global warming set by the Paris Agreement, then we shouldn't underestimate the massive disruption it will create to our existing economic framework as companies across a wide range of industries and across all regions will need to profoundly adjust and adapt their business model to make it fit for the net zero economy. That will create transition exposure. Some companies will raise to the challenge and benefit from it greatly, but some other companies might suffer and some actually may also disappear. Massive disruption. For those who don't believe that we will succeed in keeping global warming within 1.5 to 2 degrees and believe that it's going to be more business as usual, global warming is likely to exceed 3.5 degrees. Yes, there will be in that scenario much less transition exposure because companies won't need to adapt their business model and change that much. But companies will face the huge consequences, financial consequences of physical risks and litigation risks, which again will very seriously disrupt the economy. So there is today real climate-related financial exposure, which could actually threaten the stability of the financial system. And this is, I think, the first major challenge that we all face in looking at the net zero transition. That, of course, leads me to the second challenge that we face, which is climate is an incredibly complex topic. It's extremely complicated. And in the finance industry, we have a lot of very clever people, but the reality is that we are still lacking climate experts, which is, again, a very, very complicated topic. In our industry, looking at climate, we're going to need to answer a wide range of very complicated questions, ranging from what kind of emissions to focus on. Is it direct emissions, indirect emissions? What do we do with avoided emissions? What's happening with carbon offset, and so on and so forth. And sadly, we don't really have today a common framework on which we can rely, which could serve us as a guiding principle to allocate capital. In fact, the EU taxonomy has tried to put that in place, as we all know, but unfortunately, the EU taxonomy is not terribly helpful. It classifies green activities with a very high level of granularity. So under the EU taxonomy definition, an activity is either green, and if it isn't green, it's brown. So it really fails to capture the need of a transition, which is absolutely essential for the finance industry, because we need to support and accompany those companies that are brown today, but are making all the right investments and policy and strategy change to become greener. And then we have a third issue, which is extremely important, which is scale. The role and the mission of the finance industry is to fund the real economy. We need, as an investment industry, we need to be able to deploy capital at scale. Well, the reality today is that the real economy today is not at all aligned or close to being aligned to the goals set by the Paris Agreement and certainly to the net zero objective. In fact, probably less than 10% of companies globally are getting close to be aligned to the goals of the Paris Agreement, and that is leaving us with a huge challenge of having to deploy capital at scale where the vast majority of companies are still misaligned. We need more pressure on the real economy to force them or to force companies to get on the right decarbonization trajectory. So that leads me to basically how we should be approaching the capital allocation with a very strong net zero mindset, which is again the issue that our whole industry is trying to approach today. We think that it should be, particularly if we want to align it with our fiduciary duties, it should be about neutralizing climate-related financial exposure. If we all agree that the net zero transition is going to be one of the biggest economic disruption of all time, we need to neutralize climate-related financial exposure. This is what we should do. And in order to do that, there are really sort of two things we should be very focused on. First, we need to move away from the simple exclusion approach, particularly those exclusion based on how companies today polluting or not, high carbon footprint. And we need to focus much more on understanding the specific company's transition trajectory. It is all about transition. We need to understand the decarbonization pathway that a company is pursuing. We need to understand its strategy to reduce by 50% its emissions by 2030, which is the first milestone of the Paris Agreement. And we need to understand the strategy to get to net zero by 2050. And that is really important. Once we understand this specific company transition trajectory, we can start to understand, quantify, and assess the financial consequences as a result of that transition. What the finance industry should be focused on ultimately, and the investment industry in particular, is what will be the structure of cash flows of a company as it moves down towards that transition, as it implements the net zero transition. And then we can start to use climate neutral, climate related financial exposure as our guiding principle to allocate capital. And this is how we are all going to be moving towards implementing our net zero commitment and helping the economy to move in the right shape.
Thank you very much, Hubert. And that was a fantastic call for greater levels of ambition to be able to deploy the capital that you and others want to deploy towards this monumental task. And thank you to all of our speakers. I think for the first time ever at an Onward event, everyone kept to 5 minutes, and we've now got a proper amount of time for Q&A. If anyone, I have a question lined up, but we have a few questions in the audience. So I'm going to take a question from Guy Newey from Energy Systems Catapult first. Sorry, Guy.
Thanks, Will. I'm going to pick up some of the points that Rhian-Marie made about local, particularly, when you think, as you said, lots of the challenges we're going to face, EV, energy infrastructure, heat networks, what we're going to do about hydrogen in industry. These are local questions, but in many ways, it's kind of missing bit of how we organise action on climate change. So I guess it's a question for the Secretary of State, was how important he sees local and place-based activities, and what needs to happen policy-wise to get our cities, local government able to invest in the priority infrastructure that we're getting.
I think, Guy, you've really hit the nail on the head. I think there's a huge amount of work that we need to do to work out how the local fits in with the national agenda. Clearly, as Secretary of State, I have to look at the national picture. We're looking at the national the distribution of gas, the electricity system operator, the electricity system. There's also huge appetite from people like Andy Burnham, Ben Houchen, others, operating locally. And how we fuse the two is still a work in progress. And I think actually, if you're going to have a nimble system, it has to have a huge local input. We've got local energy hubs, but we haven't really, I think, done enough to create a system where people who have local initiative, local enterprise, real interest in local energy sources, how that fits into the wider net zero strategy. The net zero strategy actually does, it's coming out later this year, will touch on some of those issues, but there's a lot more work to be done on that.
Thank you very much, Guy. I'm not going to go to the other panelists on that particular question because it feels relatively specific and not related to the kind of financial questions that we're broadly here to discuss. And I should have said just at the beginning is if all questions could try and keep us firmly on the brief of the discussion as possible. I realise that when we have cabinet ministers, there's always a temptation to ask broader questions. But on that note, Jess Shankerman from Bloomberg.
On that note, exactly. This is I want to ask about European UK gas prices, which may seem irrelevant, but it's incredibly important for green transition. Goldman Sachs has just warned of European blackouts. Amos Hochstein, US Secretary of US State Department envoy for energy, said on Friday he was worried about gas supplies and that Europe isn't doing enough. Are you worried about gas supplies, and do you think the UK can?
We're monitoring the situation. Clearly, we're aware of what's going on, and that's all I'm prepared to say at the moment, because this is not a forum for speculation about what the gas prices are going to be.
Thank you. Again, I'm going to if I could take a question from Melanie on, and I will come, if possible, to Anne-Marie and Hubert as well on this question, if it was right. So, Melanie.
Finance related question.
Thank
Oh
you.
wow, let's turn up for the book.
I did want to just get the sense from your comments, Hubert, that there is a reticence in the finance community to be fully invested, not financially, but fully wholeheartedly invested in green initiatives, unless there is something that can be evidenced. So it feels like there is something that needs to already be established before funding can be unlocked. And I'm interested, particularly now I see Guy is here, and we've got Catapult represented, on the innovation side of things. If we're looking at that breadth of new technologies and new innovations, is the finance community prepared to support at an innovation level, where we're seeing technologies like hydrogen, which are just in their infancy, really? Are we going to see sufficient funding for initiatives like that? Or do you think that perhaps the finance community needs to see more in terms of policy direction than it has so far?
I think it's a very good question, and I'm sure that you might also have some views on that. So I will perhaps just make one quick introduction. I think we have to make a real distinction when we talk about sustainable finance between greening existing capital and funding green investments. This is really, really important because the two sit very differently in our industry. The biggest challenge that we have as a finance industry is the greening of existing capital, because looking at just the investment industry, this is $120 trillion of capital that need to be redeployed. Needs to be redeployed in a way that it is aligned with the challenges and opportunities of the environmental transition. This is a massive task. And what I've just, in my introductory remark, tried to highlight is the challenges when looking at just the environmental transition through the net zero lens. Then there is the whole question of funding green investments. That, I think, there are going to be lots of different alternatives. And yes, indeed, public to private sector initiatives might be quite useful to de-risk some of the investments. And there might be, I think, an increasing interesting range of opportunities to finance, and particularly around natural capital, new technology, the whole area of infrastructure and real assets. These are areas which I really can see the finance industry being quite interested in, and obviously wanting to play its part. Having said that, it's always going to be a small proportion of that 120 trillion. So we need to make that clear distinction between the two. I don't know whether you have any.
Yeah, if I might build on that. So to answer your question directly, the way to think about finance in this context is very much horses for courses. It isn't appropriate for certain types of financial institutions to invest in early stage innovation and technology. It is not what their risk mandate has been set up to do. And Secretary of State earlier alluded to the offshore wind success in the UK, where we've got 40% of global offshore wind capacity sits around the British coastline. It is a global success story. But even with the contracts for differences in place and the regulations that needed to be brought in about seabed leasing and setting up all the auctions and everything else, that we still needed the Green Investment Bank to meet those early stage construction and technology risk in an unproven technology as it was. And you're absolutely right, Secretary of State, now it is entirely funded by institutional investment, which was crowded in. So we do have a blueprint about how this should work. So to answer your question, early stage technology innovation is going to be the challenge of both public and private capital working together to risk share. Sorry, go ahead.
No, not at all.
I was just going to say, sorry, I'm hogging the microphone. I was just going to pick up on a very important point that Hubert made, though, which is about greening finance and financing green, and making sure that we're getting the balance right there. In that, yes, ensuring that we green finance and the 120 trillion of assets that are allocated is absolutely critical for financial stability. Right? That is why we have 83 central banks all working in the network for greening the financial system at the moment, because they recognize this is a systemic risk. However, you cannot mitigate systemic risk through just divesting from harder to abate sectors. What you actually need to do is use the forceful stewardship of asset ownership to ensure that companies are being held to their transition strategies and that they are genuinely innovating and doing all they can. And it's the role of the primary markets, so the banks, the real asset investors, the venture capitalists, the private equity investors, to actually pump money into the real economy so that we actually see that climate stability goals being reached. So I think we've reached a really interesting point in this sort of green finance discussion, where I think increasingly post-COP, we're going to be seeing more and more emphasis on how do we get more capital where we need it to go in the real economy, and maybe less discussion about, you know, how do we disclose, how do we report, how do we allocate assets in the secondary market. And because, you know, the scientists are telling us we need to get a move on this. All right, sorry.
Good. I'm going to take a question from George Grills from the Times, and then I'll come over here. George.
Yes, in the Secretary of State, your co-panelists have outlined essentially a carrot and stick approach the government could take to sort of encourage people towards net zero. On the one hand, the carrot that's sort of subsidising consumers, on the stick side, taxing and carbon taxes. As the recent NAO report showed, the Green Home Grant, it's actually quite hard to give people free cash. So do you recognise that the government needs to take a carrot and stick approach? And if the public won't take the carrot, when's the time for the stick?
I think the carrot and stick analogy is a little crude. I think there are incentives. I mean, a classic example of, I don't know whether it's a stick or a carrot, but a classic example of this was the signal about EVs. You know, we've essentially said that you won't be able to buy ICEs after 2030. And that's been a huge incentive, not only for consumers, but also for auto manufacturers. I mean, a large amount of my time as Secretary of State in the last year has been spent talking to auto companies, because they can see the transition, they can see, and they see it as a big prize. So again, is it a carrot or is it a stick? You know, the people are being incentivized to deliver products, and consumers are actually leading the charge on this. So I think that there are ways in which you can stimulate demand through legislation, and also through just signaling. One of the things I was very pleased about when I was energy minister was coming out with the energy white paper, long awaited as it was. But when it came out, it really did galvanize a lot of enthusiasm. So in terms of, I mean, we can talk about the Green Homes Grant, I mean, but, you know, we have to design an offer, an attractive enough offer for people to take it up. But I think the signs are good that a huge number of people are much more engaged with this issue. Lastly on that, you know, I've fought 5 general elections as a candidate from 2005, I think was the first time. 2019 was the only and the first time that this actually came up as an issue on the doorstep. Climate change, the fight against climate change, global warming, all of these issues were resonated with the public, and that's going to increase. I'm very confident of that.
Thank you. I'm just going to pose the question in a slightly different way to our 2 other panelists, because it seems to me that we could kind of expect some of this to happen organically, or we could ask policymakers like the Secretary of State and his colleagues in Parliament to adopt a slightly more accelerated timescale and potentially a more active or interventionist approach in order to drive markets towards specific outcomes. To what extent do you think, perhaps I could come to Hubert first and then Marie second, but just to what extent do you think investors, markets generally, are looking to policymakers to actually intervene and to be slightly more front-footed and give some of that certainty and some of that long-term view? Or do you think investors are hoping some of this will happen organically through market mechanisms?
I think they are, you know, I think the responsibility for the transition is often, perhaps a little bit too often, passed on to policymakers. And I think that is potentially a little bit unfair, because the reality is that, in our view, certainly, there are a number of forces that are driving the transition. Some of these forces are more powerful than others. I would tend to personally believe that market forces is the most powerful force driving the transition towards net zero. And to go back to the examples of EV versus IC cars, you know, my personal belief is it is the economics of electronic vehicles of EVs that are now driving the transition of the entire automotive industry. And the fact that they saw competitors of theirs, the success that it had, and the price at which it was able to basically manufacture and sell EV cars as one of the important turning points. So I think we should never underestimate the fact that a number of these cleaner solutions are also cheaper and are more efficient and are going to be a very important force for the transition. Yes, policymaking has a role to play, absolutely. So does the change of consumer behaviors, and that change is also happening. So I think it's also important to realize that the force that consumers are going to have in driving the transition. And then finally, you have indeed capital and finance. And I think we've talked a lot about that already, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that. But there is a very strong need and desire of the finance industry to make sure that the capital that is being deployed is increasingly so aligned to these environmental challenges and opportunities, as well as involved in some of these early stage financing needs. So I think these are four important forces which need to act together, and which in my view are already very clearly in place.
So I'm going to take a more interventionist answer, not because I don't believe in the power of the markets. I absolutely do. And I think if we had all the time in the world, the markets would solve this issue. I believe in markets, but I believe in physics more. And I do have a PhD in it. And climate change is based on the inviolable laws of physics, and it's putting a timer on how quickly we need to do this. And so EVs, I think, is a fantastic example, Secretary of State, where we have seen that the clear policy signaling has really helped the manufacturers on this. Some of the work that we do with consumers is right now it's quite difficult to get equally competitively priced leasing products for buying electric vehicles versus internal combustion engine. And the reason for the number of reasons for that, but one of the reasons is because we don't have a secondary market in vehicles. So it's very difficult for the leasing companies and the banks to figure out at the end of that period, if they want to take security over that vehicle, what will its value be? So whenever there's uncertainty, you have to, that obviously leads to risk. And so you have to price that in. So again, and I'm determined to make this point this morning about public-private collaboration. One of the potential mechanisms that we could look at is government balance sheet being deployed to actually support the residual value of electric vehicles, to give the private financiers comfort, which over time, obviously, we would expect to see, it's a pump priming mechanism that we wouldn't need over time as that secondary market builds up. And there are obviously similar examples of what we could do in the housing sector as well, where, to the point the questioner made, there are greater complexities about the supply chain and expertise and builders. So, but we just need to make sure that the finance isn't the blocker. That's what's really important, I think.
It's fantastic. Thank you very much. So a few people in the audience, we've got two more questions. I'm going to take them both together, and then I've had a few questions online as well, which I'm keen to get to. So Lizzie from Carbon Brief, and then at the back, and yeah, if we can just go one after the other straight away, that'd be great.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, so it's great that so many institutions, finance, etc., have signed up to net zero targets. But just wondering, is there any kind of, these aren't legal frameworks, and there is no legal framework around this, introducing accountability. Is there any interest to kind of introduce accountability, and what happens if the company, say we get to 2030 and half the economy hasn't hit its net zero target? What happens there?
And then just straight away at the back.
Yeah, Simon from Ogo. I just wanted to ask if there was any comments the panel would like to make on the other form of capital. We talked a lot about institutional capital, but what about retail capital, and thinking about the 18% of emissions that come from people's homes? They get their capital from mortgages, from personal loans, and retail finance. Really interested to hear what we can do to unlock that element of capital in the system.
Thank you. If I can ask, just go to each of our speakers in turn.
So I'll just say, I mean, I think your point about retail finance, if you like, is absolutely central. And one of the work I was very interested in, and we spoke about this with Rianne and Marie, is about how we can get a kind of green credit bank idea. I was very pleased to see the National Infrastructure Bank being launched. And I think over time, I'm hopeful that there will be a kind of credit retail element to it. Because it seems to me that we've tried to have green mortgages, we've tried to kickstart these various green products, but there's a lot of more work to be done there. And I think this is an area which central government can really take a driving role in promoting. And I agree with Hubert about the power of the market, that sometimes the market needs a little encouragement. Because after all, if we left it to free markets, we wouldn't be in the problem that we are. If market solutions naturally greened the world, we wouldn't be where we are. But clearly, there's been a market failure, and if there are market failures, then government has to legislate and intervene. And I think that the fact that we had the 10-point plan, we said 2030. There was an internal debate within government whether it should be 2040, and then it went down to 2035, and then it went down to 2030. And then, hey presto, that galvanized a huge amount of interest. So maybe I am biased being a policymaker, but clearly, policy interventions have a huge part to play in this. And then once the government sets out the path, I think, the market forces that we all know can play a very powerful role. But I think market forces by themselves cannot be relied upon, because otherwise, if they could, we wouldn't be where we are.
Anne-Marie.
Well, look, I could ball for Britain on potential retail finance solutions for energy efficiency of homes. That's one of our core flagship projects, is the coalition on the energy efficiency of buildings. The macroeconomists tell us we need 65 billion into 29 million homes by 2035 to retrofit them. But what that massive number doesn't tell us, and your point is absolutely the right one, a monolithic blob of capital doesn't translate into different business cases. So yes, green mortgages are the solution for owner-occupiers who have more a greater ability to take on more indebtedness. And I'm delighted in the last year, some of the work that we've been doing with the Loan Markets Association to come up with green home financing retrofit principles. So some of the points that Hubert making, and your question as well about, giving some standards to the market. 11 building societies and banks have started innovating green mortgages and green credit products on the basis of those principles, which has been fantastic. Then if we start looking at the green rental market, and you look at the private rental market, for example, the green mortgage doesn't solve that issue, because there you've got that split incentive problem between the landlord and the tenant. But again, and I'm afraid these solutions are really granular. They're a little bit tedious, but it's like, how do we get the riders into green rental agreements that enable the landlord and the tenant to split the benefits they get from having invested the capex up front to get the benefits of lower utility bills? Again, something that we're working on with a number of people. So like I say, I could go on about this at some length. It's absolutely critical, but there are different solutions for social housing, the rented market, the owner-occupied, and the able-to-pay market. And we need to unlock all of them. And I guess I'm going to say it again, it's all to do with actually working very collaboratively with the policymakers, not just on policy, but on financial mechanisms. And the great thing is, the private sector are ready to do this. Right? We have 360 members of our coalition. That covers nearly 70% of the UK mortgage market. We have engagement levels of nearly 90%. They come to all the meetings. They're really interested in finding a way of doing this. And do you know why? It's because otherwise they're going to have to shrink to greenness. So they need to find a way of supporting their customers in this transition. I just want to answer your question very briefly, if I may, as well, which is accountability. And I think we're at a really interesting juncture at the moment where you're seeing, for example, DWS in Germany now being investigated for some of its claims around the greenness of its product set. We've also got Tariq Fancy of BlackRock, who's come out to say that maybe some of the stuff that he did during his tenure there was a bit of a placebo and wasn't as focused on what they should be doing. So I think the market and the regulators are very alive to this. And I think with more disclosure, with more transparency, it's going to be very, very difficult to hide if you're not actually really, really walking the walk on this.
So perhaps just on this point, to be very specific, I think TCFD is coming out with its latest recommendation for a very comprehensive analytical framework, which hopefully will be adopted globally by all financial institutions. And it is the framework of implied temperature rise. And this is absolutely key, because it is the first time that we're going to have, through a single metric, we're going to be able to understand on what decarbonization trajectory companies are. So a 2-degree company will mean that it is basically pursuing a decarbonization pathway that is in line with the Paris Agreement, whereas a 3-degree company won't. And so I think creating transparency on that is going to be quite important, and the wide adoption of the latest TCFD recommendation is going to be important. I will finish by making just one little point, perhaps the Secretary of State. I completely agree with the fact that we wouldn't be there if market forces had, if the private sector would have been, playing its part. The only thing I would say in sort of defense of
I'm not having a go.
The only thing I would say is that I think one of the fundamental problems that we've had is our economic model has not priced externalities. So carbon emissions is still more or less free. There is no comprehensive pricing mechanism for carbon. And frankly, the wide utilization of nature and the exhaustion of nature is also free. And if you were to put a price on these things, I think the framework will adjust itself.
Yeah.
I'm going to unfortunately have to cut it we'll bring it to a close there because we're right on time, and I know the Secretary of State has another meeting immediately afterwards. But thank you all so much for joining. Thank you so much to our speakers for being so incredibly open. And I mean, it was a very wide-ranging and deep discussion getting into the nitty-gritty of some of these incredibly important issues, and on a subject which, within the wider net zero debate, perhaps doesn't get as much attention in Whitehall as it perhaps does in the city. But I'm very encouraged by what I heard. And if I can just finish by saying two things. Firstly, Onward will continue to do considerable work in this space. We have our program on getting to zero, and we will continue. We have 2 papers coming out in the next month or so, and we'll be continuing that work over the next year. And please do engage with us as we do that. And finally, if I could just say thank you very much to Lombard Odier again for helping us to put on this event, and to the Secretary of State, Riyad Mahrez, and to Hubert in particular for speaking. So if you can just join me in a round of applause. And
thank you.